Hi, I'm Lone Candle. The United States has been forward deployed with military troops and assets in East Asia since the end of World War II. U.S. forces remain there to discourage aggression from states in the region against U.S. allies and partners. For countries with U.S. troops actually in them, like South Korea and Japan, an attack on one of those countries may hit or embroil U.S. troops or assets, automatically bringing the United States into the war. For countries without them, like Taiwan, nearby U.S. forces could be used to intervene in a conflict, and potential aggressors know this. Therefore, the main point to U.S. troops in the region is to deter aggression because the U.S. is able to immediately intervene on behalf of the defenders, can use its current positions as staging points for larger conflicts, and the presence of U.S. forces may force the U.S. into a war, increasing its credibility to defend allies. Unfortunately, such forward deployments cost money, and if there is a war, it's more likely that the U.S. will be drawn in because the U.S. is more likely to be targeted directly, and the U.S. will be tempted to help because they have assets in the region available to help. It's possible that the U.S. presence makes war more likely by antagonizing and striking fear into China, and countries may be free riding off of U.S. defense by limiting their own military development and using the U.S. to defend them. Some say the U.S. should pull out and lead the region. My question is, what will the countries of the Indo-Pacific do if the U.S. pulls out? Secondly, if China does dominate East Asia after the U.S. pulls out, how does that affect the United States? Why would it matter? U.S. options. I'm looking at 3 different types of U.S. policies. One is forward deployment, current U.S. policy. The second is offshore balancing. This is where the U.S. pulls out its forward deployed troops, but maintains agreements and military support to both allies and partners. Partners and allies will build up their militaries with U.S. support, while the U.S. gradually pulls out. Asian countries will be expected to work together and to maintain the capacity to deter and fight off Chinese aggression. If China does the unthinkable and invades a U.S. ally, the U.S. will mount a rescue from America. With offshore balancing, even before a war, the U.S. could deploy to a region to make sure the balance moves in its favor, but the goal is to stay offshore for as long as possible. The U.S. should have its allies do as much of the work as possible, and only leave its forces on shore for as long as necessary to secure the balance, prevent a war, or win a war. The third policy is complete abandonment. The U.S. would end all promises of rescue, break alliances and partnerships, and let the nations of the Indo-Pacific fend for themselves. The U.S. will be open to trade and investment, while also willing to sell weapons, but the U.S. won't have military partnerships with an Asian nation, and no one should expect America's help in the case of invasion. Challenges with forward deployment include not provoking other countries to counterbalance the U.S., convincing friends to do their part militarily, not fueling terrorism, resisting temptations to act foolishly, and having forces vulnerable to attack and the U.S. vulnerable to being dragged into foreign wars. The hope with the second 2 options is that Asian nations would ramp up their militaries and band together to counter China. Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines are protected by water. Afghanistan, Bhutan, and Nepal are protected by mountains. Mongolia is protected by deserts. Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam are protected by dense forests. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan are members of the Russian-led Collective Security Treaty Organization. Pakistan, India, Russia, and North Korea have nukes. So Chinese neighbors have great defensive advantages. Furthermore, none of these countries want to be dominated by China. So strategies that pull back U.S. forces rely on the countries of the region to step up and deter any Chinese aggression and domination. Later, I'll discuss whether or not the U.S. should pull out. First, let's talk about China and what East and Southeast Asian countries will do if the U.S. leaves. China. Aggressive and scary. China uses its large economy to coerce other countries with popular boycotts, limits on tourism, and trade restrictions. Countries that support or don't challenge China's interest get benefits like trade, investments, and aid, while those that stand against China don't get such rewards and may be punished. China uses gaining and losing access to their market to achieve its ends. For example, China boycotted key resources from Australia because Australia called for an inquiry into the origins of COVID. In 2023, CSIS counted 18 Western and Asian countries that were the target of Chinese weaponized trade since 2008, and over 123 private companies. Targets of Chinese boycotts or trade restrictions have included Japan, South Korea, Australia, Lithuania, Norway, France, the Philippines, and the Czech Republic. All this done to force countries to bend the knee, and as a warning to any country thinking of defying China. Bending a country as large as India to its knees may be unlikely, but China's economic and military power, realistically, could dominate the rest of the Indo-Pacific. Historically, China was the premier power of its local region. The power of surrounding countries paled in comparison, except a few times when foreign peoples conquered China. But even then, the conquerors didn't add China to the Mongolian or Manchurian empires, but became the new Chinese dynasty. Surrounding nations officially recognized the high place of China. The Chinese Communist Party, CCP, wants a return to this high place. They want military and economic dominance of the region. China's huge economy makes many local countries dependent on it, and the CCP can use this leverage for control. China has already used its military to take islands claimed by other countries, build islands in seas claimed by other countries, and build military installations on disputed territory. So, the CCP is willing to use military and economic means to influence its region. Creating a zone of dependence would allow China to prevent a unified front against its territorial claims and any other area of disagreement. China wants regional predominance, not harmony among equals. China cannot throw its weight around to its fullest extent as long as the United States maintains military power in the region. The smaller countries can use the U.S. to balance China. The underlying threat that China may use force is weakened when the U.S. may intervene. From Singapore to the Philippines to Japan, the United States has military installations. To China, a major power from across the sea, having such capabilities near China's coast is seen as a continuation of humiliations. It also limits the extent that China can extend its power into the Pacific, and is a constant threat to trade routes that could be blockaded or interrupted. So, to protect trade routes, extend its power further out, end a humiliation, and be the predominant military in its region, the CCP wants the U.S. out of East Asia, which would make China by far the most powerful country and allow it to dominate. China's goals from early on have been to replace the United States order, first in the region, then the world. China wants U.S. naval and air forces out of the Western Pacific, meaning the South and East China Seas. They see the South China Sea like the Americans saw the Caribbean in the 1800s and early 1900s, an extension of their land territory. Controlling this would allow their Navy to focus on projecting power out into the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The U.S. wants the Indo-Pacific to have no dominator and wants maritime access to remain free. China sees this as a U.S. strategy to maintain military primacy. China wants the people of Asia to find solutions to Asia's problems and to maintain Asia's security. China wants to create security institutions and partnerships to enhance its influence in Asia. The CCP wants a security architecture that is exclusively Asian, free of alliances, more focused on domestic security, less liberal, and rooted in Chinese economic power. They also want a security architecture more supportive of CCP ideology and principles. China has made regional institutions that exclude the United States. These include the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and the Conference on Interaction and Confidence Building Measures in Asia. China may use these to subjugate countries through its market, financial, and military power, and these are all part of China's strategy to keep Asia for Asians. China sees U.S. alliances not as part of the international order, but as part of a strategy to contain China. The CCP weakens the U.S. alliance network where it can. For example, China has become one of Thailand's largest weapon suppliers and a close exercise partner. The Belt and Road Initiative is not only an economic project, but a political and ideological one. The initiative gives China leverage which it uses to facilitate autocracy. The initiative is a part of China's goals of building a community of common destiny. China aids authoritarians worldwide, but has its highest focus on its region. It promotes national sovereignty over individual liberty, market authoritarianism over market liberalism, authoritarianism over democracy, and civil obedience over civil liberty. If China is able to secure its region in like-minded autocracies, it will be better able to project its influence over the world. China's preference for dominance and dependence doesn't end in the Asia-Pacific, but their interest and relative power are greatest there, so that's where their efforts have gone the furthest. China wants to control hearts and minds. Chinese leaders see themselves in a protracted and global public opinion war and therefore use propaganda and censorship that affect other countries. They want internal debates in other countries to tilt in China's favor. To shape discussions and information in foreign countries, China uses official propaganda in media outlets, investment in foreign media, research funding, the covert cultivation of thought leaders, aggressive United Front work, the co-optation of local civic groups, the threatening of Chinese dissidents, the monitoring of Chinese abroad students, attempts to stop unwanted academic discourse, attempts to influence education about China, Chinese diaspora citizens against parties or candidates it doesn't like, Chinese language media in diaspora communities, content in Chinese language social media like WeChat, cyber tools, and influencing discussions on social media. China actively seeks to influence the media of foreign countries and uses its own media, proxies, diaspora, social media, and business interests to advance its propaganda. It subsidizes its 5G companies and pressures companies to use them so China can gain access to personal data, intellectual property, and control of critical infrastructure. China pressures software developers and telecom service providers to limit or remove speech critical of China on certain issues. China uses market access to coerce companies and public figures from making comments critical of China. China restricts what U.S. movie companies can say in their movies, because if they say too much negative about China, they can be banned from the Chinese market. China gets Hollywood to implement many changes in its movies so as to not offend Chinese sensibilities and to protect its propaganda. China places Confucius Institutes on college campuses in other countries. These institutes not only promote Chinese culture, but Chinese propaganda. China uses inducement, coercion, and political manipulation to bring countries to its side and weaken U.S. relations with its partners. China appeals to Chinese minorities in other countries based on cultural and linguistic affinities, and uses its state-run global media service and its normal diplomatic channels to disseminate propaganda. China's normative diplomacy toward the global south is within three intersecting frameworks. First is the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative. Second is the regional cooperation platforms that may generate influence through regionalization. Third, China works directly with countries using economic diplomacy, which uses trade, investment, infrastructure, resource extraction, and financial arrangements like loans. China wants to provide an alternative order to the liberal international order. However, it does so by trying to transform and subvert it, rather than directly challenging it. China tries to get its words and phrasings used by other countries for propagandistic purposes. It also wants states to act in ways China likes. China has had better success getting countries to change practices than to use China's propaganda phrases. China's aggressive behavior. China's economy continues to advance not only in size, but technological prowess, and they use these skills to compete with the United States even in high-tech spaces. They may use their technological exports to spy on the world. In trade and investment, Chinese influence in East and Southeast Asia is surpassing that of the United States. China uses persistent diplomacy and strategic investments. China is systematically finding ways to convert their economic influence into economic coercion and their economic strength into military power. China has occupied land in disputed areas, militarily patrolled disputed areas, built islands in disputed areas, enforced fishing regulations in disputed areas, explored for oil and natural gas in waters that are not theirs, harassed military ships and aircraft, and pressed bullshit legal arguments. China said it wouldn't militarize their fake islands, but later used airfields and port facilities for military purposes. After losing a land dispute in the Philippines in a United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, court, China defied the ruling and said the court had no jurisdiction. In a May 2010 meeting of ASEAN, the U.S. offered assistance to countries dealing with China's maritime aggression. China wanted regional countries to keep quiet, but when they did not, the Chinese foreign minister walked out. He came back the next day and said, "China is a big country and other countries are small countries, and that is just a fact." China expects smaller countries in the region to defer to Chinese wishes. China has used military exercises that include firing ballistic missiles into water near Taiwan. China tried to economically punish South Korea for agreeing to host certain U.S. anti-ballistic missile systems. China temporarily banned rare earth elements from being exported to Japan after the 2010 arrest of a Chinese fishing boat captain after the trawler collided with two Japanese Coast Guard ships. China also implemented import restrictions on Philippine bananas in 2012. China has actively interfered with U.S. ships. Chinese boats pretend to ram U.S. ships. In one incident, 5 Chinese vessels surrounded and charged the USNS Impeccable, seeming to test how the U.S. would react. China has also encroached the airspace and waterways of U.S. allies, has sent aircraft along with Russia into U.S. airspace, and sent spy balloons over the United States. In 2012, Japan nationalized 3 of the 5 Senkaku/Diaoyu Islands. Chinese then boycotted Japanese goods and created an air defense identification zone over the islands in 2023. China regularly sends vessels and aircraft near the islands. China, using a 9-dashed line, claims huge swaths of the South China Sea, including areas much closer to other countries. China views the South China Sea as rightfully theirs because at some point in time it was under a Chinese empire's control. They've built nationalistic fervor around these islands, and the water around them being national Chinese territory that must be returned to its rightful place. In 2012, Chinese and Filipino fishing boats competed near the disputed Scarborough Shoal Islands, and China sent police boats. That year, the 2 countries made a deal where both countries would withdraw their ships. Only the Philippines did. China followed this up by rejecting the 2016 International Tribunal verdict. China uses its Coast Guard to stop Filipinos from accessing their traditional fishing waters in the Scarborough Shoal. China imposes an annual fishing ban on the South China Sea, affecting Vietnam, the Philippines, and other countries. China sends fleets into disputed maritime territory and uses things like water cannons, military-grade lasers, and fishing boats to harass Filipino fishermen and the Philippine Coast Guard. China has increased its military presence near features claimed by the Philippines, and has used its Coast Guard to patrol the Senkaku Islands and encroach territorial waters. China has also used Navy survey ships to gather data and research that could be used for multiple purposes, including helping submarines navigate the area. Russia and China have conducted joint patrols and naval exercises in the East China Sea. Unlike in the South China Sea, China has not deliberately altered the status quo in the East China Sea, where Japan is strong relative to the naval capabilities of Southeast Asian countries. China has sought overseas military footprints. It utilizes its commercial arrangements to use foreign ports to support military functions. China used to repeatedly state that it would never seek an overseas base, but in 2017, China opened up one in Djibouti. China says it's a logistics facility, but it has Marines with armored vehicles and artillery. In 2015, Xi promised not to militarize the Spratly Islands. He broke that promise. China has no legal basis for its 9-dash line claim in the South China Sea, but it enforces it with bullying and military force anyways. In the 1970s and 1980s, China took over much of the Paracel Islands in the northern South China Sea and the Johnson South Reef in the Spratly Islands, which are in the southeast of the South China Sea. Both of these are in Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. In 2001, China forced a U.S. surveillance plane flying over international waters to land on Hainan Island. In 2009, China asserted its 9-dash line and worked hard to expand and reinforce their control in the South China Sea. Also in 2009, China paramilitary forces intercepted a U.S. ship and tried to cut its towed sonar array. Since then, China has regularly harassed U.S. Navy vessels. China's gray zone forces have prevented Vietnam from operating in much of Vietnam's own exclusive economic zone of the Paracel Islands and some of the Spratly Islands. China has forced Philippine forces out of its positions in the Spratly Islands and has not allowed access to Scarborough Shoal, which is in the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. China built islands and has put missiles and runways on the islands it controls. China is further developing and deploying nuclear weapons on a massive scale. China's development makes them a much greater threat to the U.S. homeland, making the United States really have to think whether it would nuke China in response to China nuking an ally. Would the U.S. give up major cities in order to maintain its nuclear umbrella over South Korea and Japan? If Asian countries doubt this enough, they will have the incentive to build their own nukes to act as a deterrent against China. Russia, North Korea, and China are all aggressive about territorial claims on democracies. China would have trouble conquering countries in its region because of the nationalist backlash and the support other countries would likely provide to that country, not including Taiwan. However, China can steal bits of territory and bully economically without a full-on invasion, and these actions can produce dominance without the same level of shock and backlash. China as a model for the region and the world. China's state media has declared China's socialist system as an alternative model for Western liberal democracy. China advertises its global vision as a community of common destiny. They emphasize state sovereignty over human rights and freedom. China promotes its vision of a global community of shared future where all countries work toward economic development, stability, and a common prosperity. It's against bloc politics where ideological alliances try to impose their universal values on the world. It's against universal human rights and says that different countries can define human rights differently. China believes U.S. power is declining and should decline, and that China should have a greater say in the international system. If the U.S. leaves East Asia, Asian countries may decide to hope China's positive words are sincere and bandwagon. Without U.S. help, they may have little choice. China's positive rhetoric about shared prosperity may seem more convincing when China is the unchecked military power in the region. A U.S. retreat may give validity to the new world order that China calls for. China says the U.S. should remove itself from the region and that Asians should govern Asia. If the U.S. leaves, other countries may see this and China's immense military power and say, well, I guess we're going with China's vision of common prosperity. China also advances Asian values as values not compatible with democracy. In Confucian societies, collective interest is held higher than individual interest, so one must obey authority as if obedience itself is a grand value. Social order is more important than freedom. Taiwan's existence as a liberal democracy not only refutes that Asian societies can't thrive as democracies, it refutes that Chinese societies can't thrive as democracies. China fears democracy and fears a world led by a democratic hegemon. China actively tries to support authoritarianism around the world and to corrupt and destabilize democracies. Democracy prevention is an important international strategy for China. Chinese leaders also see themselves as the heirs to the Chinese emperors who had the mandate of heaven to control a massive landmass and to have heavy influence in nearby states. A U.S.-led world with China playing second fiddle is outside the historical norm and needs to be corrected. The Chinese Communist Party wants to lead China out of the century of humiliation and into its rightful place as world leader. While it's not true that the U.S. is actively trying to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party, a world of democracy, freedom, and human rights does threaten the CCP because their people may realize they don't have these things and decide they want them. The country isn't truly communist, so the regime's legitimacy rests on economic growth and devaluing alternatives. China wants to make the world as friendly as possible to their authoritarian rule. They want as few democracies as possible, especially close to their borders. China spends billions every year on anti-democratic tools that include non-governmental organizations, media outlets, diplomats, advisors, hackers, and bribes used to defend autocrats and attack democracies. China gives weapons, cash, and prevents UN censure while sanctioning those who advocate for human rights. China gives riot control gear, advice, trade, investment, and loans to help authoritarian governments, weakening the effects of Western aid conditions involving corruption, good governance, and democracy. China's ideological efforts pose a threat at multiple levels. I discussed 3 problems below. 1. China's reach is far and wide. Private companies and individuals from countries around the world have been silenced by China's economic retaliation. China doesn't simply limit the speech of its own citizens, but of citizens from free countries like the United States. China has key posts in international institutions that it uses to move global governance towards illiberalism. China uses this influence to protect autocrats who violate international norms. Additionally, China has built a strong military with which it can wipe out democracies, like it threatens to do with Taiwan. 2. Authoritarianism has been spreading globally since 2006. This gives China an opportunity to strengthen the current headwinds against democracy. 3. The digital revolution gives China an opportunity to influence people and control societies. Such technology helps them spy, repress, and control, both domestically and internationally, and China is happy to share related technological advances with fellow autocrats. Following the path of expansionist Chinese empires. Throughout the long history of China, the Chinese empire expanded by warfare. When it was weak, it shrunk or failed to expand. But at times of strength, China conquered its neighbors, then assimilated and colonized them. They are still assimilating and colonizing some regions today. Countries the Chinese empire could not conquer were expected to submit, give tribute, and officially acknowledge the superiority of China. Because China was such a dominant power, other countries played along and acknowledged Chinese superiority. When deemed necessary, China would intervene in one of its neighbors with military force. So, historically, China was an expansionist, colonizing hegemon who guarded and policed its sphere of influence. Chinese delegations that traveled to accept tribute and the acknowledgement of Chinese superiority often gave more in gifts than they received, and such tribute was kind of a form of trade. The Belt and Road Initiative is reminiscent of Chinese vassal tribute missions. China gives aid and access to its market, but if one of the vassals act in ways China does not like, they may lose this aid or lose access to Chinese trade. The Chinese emperor also spreads influence by what it thought was its superior culture. This spread both naturally and intentionally. Neighbors that adopted Chinese culture were considered part of the inner world, while those further out that did not adopt Chinese ways were considered uncouth barbarians and the outer world. Today, the practice continues in the form of China supporting authoritarian regimes, which it sees as more similar to its own. Historically, China didn't believe in equal relationships with foreign countries. China was the light of civilization. Its emperors had the mandate of heaven. All others were below China in this hierarchy and inferior. When forced to accept subordinate or equal positions, they resented it and sought dominance when their power reascended. This appears to be happening again, despite the rhetoric of common prosperity and making common cause with the global South. China still sees itself as number one and expects other countries to submit to the mandate of heaven. We see China reasserting itself today and using force and coercion on states that it believes are not its equal. That's why China so willingly uses military force to take islands, builds islands to steal maritime territory, and uses economic coercion when countries take actions the Chinese Communist Party does not like. China's history is that of an expansionist empire that practiced settler colonialism. Before the Chinese communists came to power, they criticized the Chinese empires as empires that forcibly conquered other nations. The communists promised national liberation for minorities in China, including the right to separate fully and have political independence. Once the communists came to power, they decided to keep those minorities under the thumb of the empire. The anti-imperialist rhetoric then only applied to foreign countries. Instead of national liberation, minorities could gain a closely supervised autonomy within China. The Miao people, who lived in south-central China, didn't want to be dominated and taxed by the Chinese Empire, so rebelled. The empire responded with murder and suppression. The Qing doubled China in size during the 1700s and 1800s. These empires justified their conquests by the innate virtue of the emperor who had the mandate of heaven. The Chinese Empire was initially formed in the 200s BC by one of the original states in northern China conquering the others, and ruling these lands by force, burning books, and killing scholars. He then conquered more. As China conquered people it saw as uncivilized, it sent colonists there to settle and help civilize the natives. For centuries, the Chinese Empire sent military and civilian colonies to conquered peripheries to help solidify the empire's rule over these territories. In this process, Han Chinese names and language supersede local languages. This process continues to this day. So, not only is China acting aggressively with its military and especially its economy, it's really a continuation of the ancient Chinese Empire. An empire that expands by force, colonizes, and expects all its neighbors to submit to the superiority of China. What will the region do? China is building a massive number of naval ships, attempting to control waterways off their coast, creating a chain of bases and logistical facilities well past their coast, developing and has developed advanced air defenses, quiet submarines, anti-ship missiles, and other anti-access aerial denial technologies, and is openly developing its military to have the power to conquer Taiwan. Essentially, China is building a military with the purpose of defeating the US in East Asia. If the US pulls out, will other countries develop and pay for militaries to stand up to China? Without the US, what would the Indo-Pacific countries do to deal with the aggressive and domineering power of China? Options for Asian countries. China's neighbors have different options for how to deal with China without the US. I'm putting these options in three general categories: hard balancing, soft balancing, and bandwagoning. Hard balancing means the countries of the Indo-Pacific building up their militaries and their relationships with each other to stand relatively united against any Chinese aggression. This would see them ready to fight China if China went too far with any countries in the region. Soft balancing would be countries using diplomacy and international institutions to push against Chinese dominance, but not attempting a military deterrent. Bandwagoning is submission. This is countries accepting China as the regional hegemon and soft emperor of East Asia. Sometimes it's better to give the big man what he wants than face the consequences of standing up for yourself. To stand without U.S. forward deployment, Asian countries will need air defense systems of various kinds, large stockpiles of weapons that include missiles, drones, mines, and satellite systems for the wealthiest countries, and high-quality military training. Japan. Japan is key to East Asian balancing. They have the second largest economy in the region, the third largest in the world, and a strategic location along China's coast. Of countries in East and Southeast Asia, Japan is in the best position to take over as the lead balancer. Without the United States, China's neighbors are collectively far weaker than China. But they don't need to match China pound for pound. They just need the capacities to check Chinese aggression. Militarily, this will require two things: a military buildup and strategic coordination between the local countries. If not formal alliances, the countries must at least be prepared to work together to fend off Chinese aggression and make it clear to China that they would actually follow through on this cooperation. Unfortunately, Japan faces two major obstacles. One is domestic. The Japanese people have become accustomed to having a small military with limited capabilities. To be the leader of a China-balancing coalition would require a great expansion of the military, which would require a major adjustment in culture and budget. The second is external. It wasn't that long ago when Japan was an imperial power invading the countries it now needs as partners. these countries may still resent Japanese actions, and some are reluctant to intensively cooperate with Japan at a military level, which may require Japanese equipment and troops on their soil. In the case of offshore balancing, where the U.S. maintains its alliances and its deep support for its Asian allies, but without forward deployment, I suspect Japan gets over its hurdles and becomes a major leader in Asia. I suspect Japan would develop a closer relationship with its neighbors while still relying on the U.S. for military technology and equipment. For thousands of years, the Japanese have arisen as a people in part by not being Chinese. They have similar culture in many ways, so to keep their unique identity, they have to understand what separates them from their giant neighbor across the sea. The Japanese do not want to be Chinese and do not want to submit or bandwagon. If they still had heavy U.S. support and officially an alliance, there is a good chance Japan will step up and help lead a balancing coalition. However, in the case of complete abandonment, Japan will have to look deep within itself and decide if it has the stomach to lead such a coalition without the backing of the United States. Would deeper accommodations toward China be better than massive military costs? I believe Japan would still want to be fiercely independent. But because there'd be little hope of the U.S. ultimately intervening in a war that went bad for Japan, I think to ensure their survival and to prevent China from using their nuclear weapons to bully Japan, Japan would develop nuclear weapons. Japan showing potential. Japan shows signs that it may be willing to take on the burden of balancing China, even if the U.S. pulls out. Japan is trying to enmesh itself into the Indo-Pacific economy, institution, and rules-making processes. After Trump dropped the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Japan led efforts to put into effect the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, showing that on economic and diplomatic matters, it is willing to step up when the U.S. falters. Japan has been trying this multilateral approach while also maintaining its U.S. alliance for military defense. However, to truly balance, Japan will need to greatly strengthen its military. Japan plans to double its defense spending and increase its power projection capabilities. Japan has the world's 4th largest navy and 9th largest air force. Japanese forces have become increasingly autonomous from American forces. Japan has plans to defend far-out Southwest islands and retake them if it needs to. Japan has built a robust intelligence infrastructure and no longer has to rely on information from the U.S. They have built up plutonium stocks, created reprocessing facilities, and developed a rocketry program. Japan has started working more with others in the region to balance China, like Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, and India. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe visited 10 members of ASEAN in his first year in office. Japan wants Southeast Asian countries to unite against Chinese aggression. Japan has spearheaded closer relations with India, some of which the U.S. has piggybacked on. With Australia, Japan is developing a security relationship. Japan promised developmental assistance and has proposed an initiative where Japan promotes the rule of law and supports maritime security in Southeast Asia by giving surveillance and technical assistance and with more defense equipment and technology cooperation. Japan loosened bans on the export of weapons while also providing ways to help countries purchase such weapons. Japan has helped equip and train maritime police forces because doing so is more allowed under Japanese law. Japan has given ships and military equipment to both Vietnam and the Philippines. In 2017, Japan sent its largest ship through the South China Sea to port calls and joint exercises. There have long been pushes from some quarters of Japan to create more autonomous self-defense capability. This was more heavily discussed during fears of Trump ruining the relationship. Trump sparked a lot of fears of abandonment, and some of Trump's actions made Japan feel disrespected as the junior partner. Japan no longer trusts American security commitments, while at the same time China has been assertive. The U.S. is both budget-restrained and facing an array of weapons from China designed to kill American vessels and installations. If Japan is already building up its military in fear of abandonment, then under actual abandonment, they may do the same or more. Japan's military buildup is good for itself if the U.S. leaves, but also good for the alliance if it lasts. Japan is currently committed to the alliance, which survived Trump's first term. Japan has not hidden that it has concerns about China and that it does not want to live in a China-dominated region. Japan wants East Asia structured by value-oriented diplomacy based on universal values like diplomacy, freedom, human rights, the rule of law, and real market economy. They have oriented their proposed cooperation with India based on such universal values. Japan and China have ongoing frictions. Japan has disputes with China over the Senkaku/Diaoyu Islands. China doesn't accept Japan's apologies for its World War II atrocities. China often dregs up popular fury over Japan. During the 1970s and 1980s, China and Japan were on good terms. The 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre changed things. The Chinese Communist Party realized it needed to increase nationalism to maintain support for Chinese leadership. Better to have people worried about evil foreigners than about their own government. China began a campaign of patriotic education, which included anti-Japanese propaganda. Additionally, the fall of the USSR lost a common rival for Japan and China, and China's development made it feel like it didn't need Japanese aid, investment, and technology. Japan is worried about Chinese revisionism, as seen in China's aggressive behavior in the East and South China Seas. Despite promising signs, it's not clear to what extent Japan would stand up to China without the US. China is much larger than Japan, and its military prowess is growing. It would not be unreasonable for Japan to look at the challenge from China and to decide that moderately bending the knee is the best option. Japan's economy has had trouble growing for some time now, and it faces both population aging and population decline. That will make balancing more difficult. Thankfully, China faces similar demographic issues. Despite the tensions and Japanese nationalism, in some Japanese policy circles, there has been pushes for alignment with China. Japan has and continues to seek economic connections with China. Despite Japan's military buildup, its military is still woefully insufficient to lead a balancing coalition. Without the US, Japan will need a much larger increase in their military forces. Its 2024 budget had 1.6% of GDP going toward defense-related activities, and its goal is to reach 2% by 2027. The U.S. spends 3 to 4% of their GDP on military, but during the last decade of the Cold War, it spent over 6% of its GDP on defense. Without the U.S., Japan may need 6+% of GDP going toward defense to lead a balancing coalition against China. Japan continues to show issues in working with some potential partners. Japanese leaders visit the Yasukuni Shrine that honors war participants, including war criminals, despite that these visits incense China and Korea. Will Japan go nuclear? Since December 1967, Japan has had 3 non-nuclear principles: no possession of nukes, no production of nukes, and no introduction of nukes. And Japan has signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. China not only has nuclear weapons, but is growing and modernizing its arsenal. If Japan wants to truly help balance China and wants to avoid facing one-sided nuclear blackmail, it will need nuclear weapons if it loses the U.S. nuclear umbrella. Even if the U.S. pulls out but maintains the alliance, Japan may decide it doesn't trust the U.S. to battle across the Pacific and East Asia on its behalf, so builds nukes just in case. Japan not only needs nukes to deter China, but to balance North Korea. India. Sometimes we think of East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia as 3 separate regions, but strategically, the US and Japan have been pushing for seeing a larger Indo-Pacific region. Viewed from this broader standpoint, India is a major power that borders China and has an incentive to prevent Chinese hegemony in Asia. Japan, the United States, Australia, and India are already coordinating to an extent in the Quad, which is partially a Chinese balancing coalition. Due to its great size, India could play an important role alongside Japan in leading and assisting Asian countries balancing China without the US. India and China still have territorial disputes, and India wants to be seen as China's equal, not some second-fiddle Asian power. India prefers that China does not dominate the region, even if it's the most powerful country in it. A Chinese balancing coalition led by Japan and India could be very powerful and had the resources to stand, even without the US. If the US backed off, either completely or more offshore, India would still not submit to China. It's too large, has nuclear weapons, and may attempt countering China with Russia. So, unlike smaller countries, submission to China is not likely. But that doesn't mean India would help those smaller countries not submit. I expect in either scenario, if Japan leads a balancing coalition, India will be convinced to join it. A China that truly dominates its region will be more free to exercise power outside of it, including in or near India. It's better for India to have a powerful neighbor that has to contend with many independent states than one that already has a level of submission from these states and who can then focus on other things, like dominating India. India fears that China will encircle it with influence in the Indian Ocean, and by partnering with Pakistan. China has made port deals with Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and the Maldives. India is already working with Japan, the US, and Southeast Asian countries. If Japan decided to bandwagon rather than balance, it's not clear how effective India would be in supporting China's neighbors. India has its own problems, and is a relative outsider in that it is a South Asian country, not a fellow East Asian island or peninsula dweller. Without Japan, India may focus more on strengthening itself and leave Southeast and East Asia to the Southeast and East Asians. India already has nuclear weapons, so there is no question to whether they will gain them in the event of the US leaving. Although India has potential to be a great balancer with Southeast and East Asian countries, it's not clear how that will work when push comes to shove. India is mainly concerned about dominating South Asia. If China mostly stays out of South Asia, India has less incentive to antagonize China by meddling in East Asia. If China starts an aggressive war in East Asia, is India really going to start a massive war in its eastern border? China has plenty of troops and equipment to fight a naval war in the east and a land war in the west. Why would India volunteer to take that on? Would India even risk war by supplying key goods to countries at war with China? It would seem wiser for India to use any troubles China has with its neighbors as leverage to get China to back off of South Asia, rather than risk the consequences of intervening. Assuming China wouldn't renege on such an understanding, it would be great for India for it to come to an understanding with China that China gets to dominate East Asia and India gets to dominate South Asia. In the potential China balancing coalition, India could be the paper tiger, who would never volunteer to heavily oppose China outside of India's core areas of interest. Furthermore, India will generally be distracted by its rivalry with Pakistan while also having trouble being a credible balancer because it still has difficult domestic issues to deal with. So, India has the potential to be a great partner to Japan in leading a balancing coalition without the US, but it's not clear how reliable they will be. India tends to focus on India rather than joining larger coalitions. Taiwan. Nationalism plays a role in the current international system. Two tenets often included in nationalism are that nations should be whole and independent. China believes the Chinese are not whole or independent because of Taiwan. The CCP is determined to conquer Taiwan, making the Taiwanese, a democratic nation, submit to the Chinese Communist Party's authoritarian system. China sees this as bringing a renegade province back into the fold and making China whole. The modern history of Taiwan is the nationalist Chinese losing a civil war against the communist Chinese and fleeing to Taiwan and claiming they are the true rulers of all China. They were able to survive thanks to the sea and the United States. Taiwan was a dictatorship and laughably claimed to be the true rulers of all China. Over time, Taiwan developed its own identity and became its own country. It even evolved into a democracy with an advanced economy. The Taiwanese want to be Taiwanese and not under the thumb of Greater China. If China tried to blockade or invade Taiwan, and if China was determined to see it through in the long haul, it would succeed if Taiwan was on its own. A reason China has not done such a thing so far is out of fear of sparking war with the United States. Without the U.S. staying in the region, Taiwan would still deeply desire to not submit. But would it have a choice? Taiwan would need to replace one protector with another. It would need Japan, and ideally a coalition of countries, to help defend Taiwan in the case of Chinese aggression. If no other country stepped up to help Taiwan deter Chinese aggression, then Taiwan would have two choices: submission or nuclear weapons. Taiwan already tried to develop nuclear weapons, but the United States stopped them. A balancing coalition that doesn't include the United States would be weaker than one that does include the United States. So even with such a coalition, Taiwan would likely develop nuclear weapons. Only such weapons could deter China with high confidence. If Japan had nukes and took a very strong leadership position, they may be able to convince countries to fall under their nuclear umbrella. But it seems most likely to me that Taiwan would immediately develop nukes if the US announced they were leaving, either as an offshore balancer or complete abandonment. It's one thing to hope that the US would immediately intervene with forward deployed troops during Chinese aggression. Another to think the US would mount a massive operation to get all their equipment and personnel across the ocean while needing to construct or borrow bases to try and remove entrenched Chinese troops from Taiwan. Taiwan may be focusing on taking on China in direct combat and threatening China's homeland with missiles rather than asymmetric warfare. It may be that an asymmetric defense strategy will only work for Taiwan if the US will intervene. If the US won't even commit to officially intervening in the case of a Chinese invasion, it may make more sense for Taiwan to focus on going head-to-head against China and deterring by threatening China itself with missiles. However, either way, without US intervention, Taiwan doesn't seem to stand much of a chance. This means Taiwan's lack of asymmetric power isn't evidence of what Taiwan's power will be if the US leaves, because they already are playing it like the US won't intervene. Either way, asymmetric or head-to-head, Taiwan is not spending enough to defend itself. With the US's ambiguous posture, Taiwan buys military equipment and strategizes to increase the chance that the US intervenes, rather than making sure they can best fight with the US. Because none of it matters if the US doesn't intervene. Taiwanese leaders believe that major arms purchases from the US increase the chance that the US will intervene. Getting less advanced or less big-ticket items from the US doesn't produce the same perception and belief that the US will help. Japan and Taiwan. Japan considers stability across the Taiwan Strait as very important and sees instability or China conquering Taiwan as a threat to Japan's survival. If China takes Taiwan, this would give China control of the South and East China Seas, giving it the ability to strangle the economies of South Korea and Japan. Taiwan is closer to a Japanese island than it is to China. Many of Japan's far-out islands would be difficult to defend if China controlled Taiwan. 90% of Japan's oil imports, 99% of its mineral resources, and 100% of its nuclear fuel come by way of the waters near Taiwan. 80% of Japan's cargo ships travel through the Taiwan Strait. China's People's Liberation Army Handbook shows a plan to use Taiwan to blockade Japan and bring its economy and war-making potential to its knees. China would control commercial shipping in the Taiwan Strait, threatening vital sea lanes for Japan and South Korea. China could then start taking Japanese islands east of Taiwan, like how Russia is trying to take oblasts from Ukraine. Taiwan without the US. There's a possibility that without the US, Taiwan decides its best option is submission. However, if Japan ramps up its military and commits to Taiwan, Taiwan may be able to successfully deter China. The logistics of a cross-strait invasion would be difficult for China. An invasion would require a huge buildup of forces, and this would be visible. So, if full-scale invasion is the plan, there may be no element of surprise. China may not be able to pull off the land, sea, and air coordination required for an invasion across water. Furthermore, they need to coordinate space, cyberspace, electromagnetic warfare, and long-range missiles. 40% of Taiwan's exports go to China, but most of the final demand is not in China. 90% of Taiwan's exports to China are processed there to be exported elsewhere. 6 of China's top 10 exporting manufacturers are Taiwanese companies. An economic breakdown between Taiwan and China would hurt China, and Taiwan could export its factory inputs elsewhere where the final demand is not China. How both the US and China act toward Taiwan will be seen as a bellwether for how they will behave toward other countries. How Taiwan is resolved will be an important test as to what kind of great power China will be. If China is too harsh on Taiwan, they risk turning the rest of the region against them. So, Taiwan has a chance of surviving without the US, but it will require a huge military buildup by them and Japan, and probably nuclear weapons. South Korea. While Japan seems focused on trying to counter and balance China, South Korea appears to be doing some countering and some appeasing. South Korea likes approaches that bring in more regional middle powers to diffuse great power tension. South Korea is relatively dependent on China economically. They are connected to China by land through North Korea and have a militarized and threatening neighbor in addition to China, North Korea. South Korea depends on China to restrain North Korea. China is South Korea's largest export market. South Korea is mostly worried about North Korea and would likely not aid Japan and the United States in defending Taiwan. South Korea has generally been more accommodating toward China than Japan. Would South Korea really build up its power, join a balancing coalition, and take the economic consequences that an angry China would spew out? Or would South Korea do what it has done historically? Keep its independence as an independent country and people, but nevertheless bend the knee to the hegemon who leads the region. Without the U.S., South Korea's key balancing partner would be Japan, but Japan and South Korea have a fraught relationship. They have territorial disputes, and South Korea is upset that Japan won't fully apologize for the atrocities of World War II. South Korea would need to beef up its military just to ensure deterrence or defeat of North Korean aggression. And, in either an offshore or abandonment scenario, Korea may no longer trust the U.S. nuclear umbrella, so it would likely develop nukes simply to deter North Korea. The country should be capable of such a military because it has a robust defense industry that creates aircraft, naval vessels, vehicles, and other weapons. Additionally, despite its military's smaller size, its conventional military is already stronger than North Korea's due to better training and technology. However, in case of war, North Korea could be supported by Russia and China. Even with the U.S. forward deployed, South Korea doesn't lend much help of any kind toward other countries facing Chinese aggression. Without the U.S., would South Korea really help Taiwan or a country defending territory or trade in the South China Sea? It's possible South Korea would step up and join a Japan-led balancing coalition, but it's at least as likely that South Korea develops nukes to ensure its survival against North Korea and China, and then accommodates China as much as it needs to. The accommodation option becomes even more likely in the complete abandonment scenario. Still, South Korea officially supports preserving peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, including in 2023 making a joint statement with Japan and the United States saying that peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait is an indispensable element of security and prosperity for the international community. China doesn't like this because this internationalizes an issue that China sees as an internal matter. While Japan and the U.S. have been making such statements for some time, this was new for Korea. Countries like Korea may decide that an international trading system based on markets, the rule of law, and mobile value chains may make more sense than focusing on economic links to China. If South Korea becomes less dependent on China, it may be more willing to buck it. If the U.S. maintains support from afar, South Korea will get nuclear weapons and has a decent chance of joining Japan and others in a China balancing coalition. If the U.S. completely abandons the region, South Korea is at least as likely to focus on appeasing China rather than balancing, and will for sure go nuclear. Southeast Asia. When it comes to countries from Myanmar to Vietnam to Malaysia to the Philippines, none of these countries want to be dominated by China. But without the U.S., will they have a choice? The countries of Southeast Asia are far more dependent on China than China is on them. They are much smaller and weaker than China. They haven't been increasing their military budgets to deter China. It doesn't seem like they see hard deterrence as worthwhile, and their economic strength is too weak to really hurt China. The most they have is soft diplomatic balancing, but will that be very effective when not in the context of another great power balancing China with hard military force? I doubt it. The major international organization that represents Southeast Asian countries is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. Currently, ASEAN wants to engage with China while also staying close to the U.S. in an attempt to play both sides while not choosing one. China picks off ASEAN countries by having extensive influence over some of them, making them more allied with China than ASEAN. That limits ASEAN's ability to stand together and promote their own unified goals. In ASEAN, Cambodia acts for China by blocking or watering down statements on the South China Sea disputes. Even with the U.S. engaged in the region, It's not clear how many countries would help Taiwan and what limited support they would give if the U.S. was in combat, much less if the U.S. backed out of the region. Southeast Asian countries are too weak, too afraid of retaliation by China, may not have much domestic political support for entering a war, and don't prioritize Taiwan. It's not clear that ASEAN countries would balance China militarily. However, if China became even more aggressive, it's possible that they would beef up their defenses and cooperation. The Philippines. The Philippines has tried to soft balance against China, appealing to international law and trying to delegitimize China's territory stealing. The Philippines has traditionally not favored containment of China, but integration of them into the region. After China aggressively stole maritime territory, the Philippines better focused on modernizing their military. They also brought a legal case against China over territory, but still tried to have positive economic relations with China. The Philippines took a maritime claim to United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, arbitration, and won on 14 of 15 claims. The tribunal ruled that there's no legal basis for China's 9-line claim. None of the disputed maritime features in the Spratly Islands are islands by the law of the sea. They are rocks, and therefore do not get a 200-mile exclusive economic zone or continental shelf, meaning that the Scarborough Shoal is within the Philippines' maritime domain. China's island creation has caused damage to coral reefs and broke the UNCLOS treaty, and with Scarborough Shoal, China broke the treaty by doing land reclamation without permission from the Philippines. China is a signatory to UNCLOS and is therefore legally bound by the decision. Nevertheless, China rejected it. This decision came days after Duterte became president of the Philippines. Duterte moved relatively away from the U.S. and toward China and Russia. He gained $24 billion in investments from China, did not press the outcome of the UNCLOS tribunal, and got China to allow Philippine fishermen to return to Scarborough Shoal. While China increased its constructions and militarization of fake islands, Duterte ignored Chinese island-building activities. According to Duterte, they can't stop China anyways, and the Americans won't help, so the best they can do is work with China. Duterte appeased China by downplaying the South China Sea disputes and agreeing to resolve them bilaterally. He also emphasized economic relations with China more than security relations with the U.S. He got more Chinese foreign direct investment and tourists. The U.S. not much helping in the South China Sea emboldened China and weakened U.S. credibility. Duterte didn't actually end the Filipino alliance with the U.S. The U.S. maintained close ties with the Filipino military. In fears that Duterte would abandon the American alliance, Japan focused on working with the Philippines and provided training, equipment, and technology. From its cooperation with China, the Philippines didn't receive as much as it thought it would economically, and distrust of China is high in the Philippines. The U.S. was patient with Duterte and cooperated with him in ways he would allow. The U.S. and Japan were able to maintain levels of military cooperation with the Philippines despite Duterte. The U.S. provided financial and technical help so that the Philippines could increase its maritime domain awareness. The Department of Foreign Affairs maintained the win given the Permanent Court of Arbitration. In previous decades, the Filipino president, Department of Foreign Affairs, and defense establishment created institutional foundations that locked in a Filipino grand strategy. With such a foundation, it was difficult for Duterte to change it on a dime. While Duterte's rhetoric was pro-China and anti-American, other parts of the Filipino government continued to cooperate with the U.S. and its allies. ISIS took over a Filipino city, and the U.S. provided weapons and advice on how to deal with the terrorists. In 2017, the U.S. provided $75 million to help the Philippines improve its intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance abilities for its counterterrorism operations. The Philippines also got $18.3 million from Australia. The U.S. and Filipino Coast Guards cooperated and ran training exercises with other Southeast Asian countries, as well as bilateral joint exercises. The National Coast Watch System developed facilities with financial and technical help from the United States. Security cooperation between the Philippines and Japan also grew under Duterte, including dialogues between high-level defense officials, joint exercises, humanitarian assistance, and Japanese loans to purchase patrol vessels. After Duterte came to power, the Philippines and Japan cooperated to increase the abilities of the Philippine Navy and Coast Guard. The Philippines received radar equipment from Japan. The Coast Guard was improved so it could deal with Chinese gray zone attacks. So, while Duterte sought and got closer relations with China, the Philippines maintained and in some ways grew its relationships with Japan and the United States during his administration. Because the Philippines' insurgency and terrorist problems spiked during his administration, they relied on the U.S. for help and relied on the U.S. to help develop their maritime domain awareness. Duterte's successor, President Marcos Jr., seems more willing to stand up to China and to accept cooperation with the U.S. The Marcos government has been vocal in protesting China's stealing of their maritime territory and that these actions are illegal. He's also modernizing the Filipino military and working with the U.S. and its allies and ASEAN. Increased connections and cooperation between Japan and the Philippines have a lot of potential. Japan can help the Philippines with technology, know-how, finance, equipment, and vessels. Japan, the Philippines, and the U.S. have conducted military exercises together. On one hand, the Duterte saga showed that even with the U.S. forward deployed, and even with a country whose population is generally supportive of the United States, the overwhelming power of China and the economic benefits it can offer can be more enticing than relying on U.S. support to help stand relatively independent of China. And even with the U.S. deployed in the region, the saga showed that the U.S. lacks credibility and whether it will actually help its neighbors. On the other hand, it showed that countries don't always get as much as they hoped when they work with China, and that political forces may push for cooperation with the U.S. when it can help enhance security capabilities. If the U.S. decided to support from afar, it's possible that Japan could entice the Philippines to help in balancing China. But that's no guarantee. If the U.S. abandoned the region, it seems unlikely that the Philippines would play a significant role in balancing China. Their relative power is too weak, and China's bribes are too tempting. Vietnam. Vietnam is not showing signs that it will balance against China with the U.S. China invaded Vietnam in the 1970s. China has aggressively pursued maritime territorial disputes with Vietnam. Under these conditions, if Vietnam isn't balancing against China, it doesn't seem likely that anyone else will. Vietnam considers India, China, and the United States as countries trying to dominate the region. Vietnam has comprehensive and strategic partnerships with Russia, India, and China, but not the United States. Over many years of close interactions with China, Vietnam has developed a way of operating with China that can help them settle disputes. Vietnam feels confident in this and doesn't feel the need to balance militarily. And, without an existential threat, Vietnam doesn't see the need to get closer to a country like the United States. That said, Vietnam does fight hard in their disputes with China. In 2024, Vietnam and China had a standoff for months over a Chinese oil rig. A Vietnamese fishing boat sank, but Vietnam maintained their pressure. In 1988, Vietnam occupied Roxon Reef so China could not get them. This led to the Battle of Johnson Reef, where Vietnam lost lives. Vietnam also fought the Sino-Vietnam Border War in 1979. China withdrew despite high Vietnamese casualties. China also seems to back off from Vietnam more easily than it does from the Philippines. Vietnam has been expanding the size of Spratly Island's features it controls. China has not prevented them from doing this. China has stopped the Philippines from bringing food, water, and other supplies to Filipino personnel on the Sierra Madre. A Philippine ship ran aground to advance a territorial claim. China might be harder on the Philippines because Vietnam fights harder, and because the Philippines is seen as a U.S. ally. Vietnam meets with China regularly in a process of managing their relationship. Vietnam has more trade with China than the U.S. Vietnam tries to soft balance by supporting legal challenges against China and those of other victims of Chinese land taking. Its hope is to dispute the legitimacy of China's actions on the world stage. However, Vietnam shows little signs of seriously balancing China militarily, other than by fighting hard on its own issues with China. Thailand. Thailand is one of the region's few American treaty allies, but in some ways they are closer to China than the U.S. During the Cold War, Thailand seemed to be on the front lines against China and Vietnam. But that is not the situation anymore. Thailand doesn't see China as a threat, instead seeing China as a benign hegemon. China is Thailand's biggest economic partner, and they work together to keep Thailand's autocratic government in power. Access to Thailand's Utapao airbase is a key desire for the US. It's an important logistic hub. Thailand doesn't always give access. Thailand did not allow access for the US to support humanitarian operations for the Rohingya while they were being ethnically cleansed in 2017 through 2018 in Myanmar. Thailand's priorities are maintaining internal control rather than worrying about Chinese hegemony. Since the 2014 coup, Thailand has increased its military cooperation with China, and the US cut funding because of the coup. China doesn't care if a country is not a democracy, and Thailand is angry that the US lifted sanctions on Egypt after its coup, but not Thailand. Considering Thailand is already favoring China, at least as much as the United States. If the US backs out of the region, either with a full abandonment or offshore balancing, Thailand would likely bandwagon with China, continuing to be focused on maintaining their autocracy. Australia. Australia is actively concerned about the power and aggressiveness of China. However, Australia's population was 26.01 million as of 2022 and its GDP 1.7 trillion. China's population was 1.4 billion and its GDP 17.96 trillion. Australia would have to use its entire fleet to match the vertical launch cell inventory of one Chinese cruiser. So, there is a significant power difference. Secondly, Australia is quite far from China, so it would need a fairly extensive reach to help countries like Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines. If the US offshore balances from afar, Australia would likely do its part in a balancing coalition. If the US abandoned the region, Australia wouldn't have the power and location to lead a balancing coalition, so it would need Japan to lead it. If Japan stepped up, Australia would likely join Japan's balancing coalition. Indonesia. One of Indonesia's greatest motivators in its approach to the international order is the desire to have autonomy in international politics. They also want to maintain their identity as a homegrown democracy. They don't want to choose sides between the two great powers. Without the US in the region, it's not clear that Indonesia would do much to balance China. Malaysia! Malaysia doesn't often use the term liberal international order, but it does appreciate the US role in sustaining the order and appreciates that it benefits from economic openness, free trade, the UN, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, and respect for international law. Malaysia does not believe the rules of the rules-based order should be static. It wants the global south to have more influence. Malaysia believes in legitimate differences in what these rules should be, and that countries shouldn't be split simply into rule breakers and rule followers. Malaysia doesn't think the West and the United States have consistently followed the rules, and wants them applied equally regardless if a country is a democracy or not. It doesn't think there should be a democracy versus autocracy mindset. Malaysia does not see the liberal international order and U.S. power and leadership as the same thing. Malaysia believes such an order is compatible with a multipolar world as well as U.S. primacy. Malaysia doesn't want to choose sides and voices support for Chinese international and regional initiatives. Malaysia agrees with China's focus on regional solutions, but also doesn't want external powers removed from the equation because they're wary of a China-dominated sphere of influence. Malaysia realizes that the U.S.-aligned system has provided a foundation for maintaining regional stability, so it doesn't see it as illegitimate like China does. Malaysia has South China Sea disputes, but nevertheless has gone forward with China trade deals. Maybe only Vietnam is being relatively strong about the South China Sea. In the case of U.S. abandonment, Malaysia may join a balancing coalition if China acted too aggressively, but otherwise would push for multilateral diplomatic approaches. Nuclear proliferation. North Korea, Russia, China, and India all have nuclear weapons. The first three act quite threateningly. Even without nuclear weapons, most countries in the region are conventionally much weaker than China. In both cases, if a country feels threatened by China, going nuclear would make a lot of sense. Seeking nukes because of perceived U.S. weakness or abandonment wouldn't be new for South Korea and Taiwan. The only reason both countries did not get nukes was because the U.S. used a heavy hand to stop them. China tested nuclear weapons in 1964. The United States normalized relations with the People's Republic of China in 1972. The U.S. lost the Vietnam War. Jimmy Carter pledged to withdraw troops from Korea in his 1976 presidential campaign, and India got nukes in 1974. Troubles like these played a role in both South Korea and Taiwan secretly developing nuclear weapons programs in the 1970s and 1980s. South Korea had a secret nuclear weapons program from 1970 to 1974. The U.S. threatened to suspend bilateral nuclear cooperation and promised arms transfers to get Taiwan to abandon its nuclear program in the late 1970s. In the late 1980s, the U.S. demanded that Taiwan renounce all nuclear weapons research. South Korea is already seriously considering nuclear weapons. The South Korean public is generally in favor of gaining nukes. Previously, the U.S. had its nukes there, but pulled them out in the early 1990s. The public wants them back, or wants their own. Hardliners in South Korea are demanding that their country gets nukes. A February 2022 poll showed 71% of South Koreans wanting South Korea to have nukes. That May, a poll found 70.2% wanting nukes, and 63.6% said they wanted them even if it violated the Non-Proliferation Treaty. If South Korea pulls out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and gets nukes, many other countries may follow. If the U.S. allowed an ally to gain nukes, the norm against nuclear weapons would be weakened, and we might see new nuclear states around the world. Japan has a nuclear allergy because of the U.S. bombing of them with nukes in World War II. However, Japan does not want South Korea to have nuclear weapons, and would likely develop their own if South Korea gained such a capability. Furthermore, if Japan loses confidence in their alliance with the U.S., Japan will get nukes for its self-defense. When the U.S. isn't seen as a country's protector, the U.S. has little ability to convince somewhat friendly countries to not get nukes. The U.S. tried to persuade both Pakistan and India from getting the bomb. The U.S. offered Pakistan some security support, but not an alliance or security guarantees. The U.S. failed with both India and Pakistan, who got nukes over the wishes of the United States. India feared Chinese aggression and Pakistan feared India, so they got nukes. The fears of East Asian allies are mitigated by U.S. support, but without that support, these countries may feel like Pakistan and India did and get nukes to protect themselves. If countries feel like their survival depends on nuclear weapons, they will get them if they have the resources to do it. Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan all have the resources, they just need the fear of China without proper U.S. backing. Offering the U.S. nuclear umbrella and threatening economic coercion kept U.S. allies from developing nukes. If these countries lose trust in the U.S. security umbrella, they will likely develop nuclear weapons. The main difficulty of going nuclear isn't the know-how, but weapons-grade uranium and plutonium. If a country has civilian enrichment facilities, they can adjust these to create weapons-grade material. Japan has plenty of plutonium in storage and advanced reprocessing and breeding reactors, so it is ready to go nuclear. South Korea doesn't have as much production capabilities, but still has them. Japan could probably go nuclear within a year if it wanted to. If a country has nuclear energy and a conventional weapons industry, they usually have nuclear latency. Generally, countries in the region do not want to have to choose a side. They like two powers, so no one can dominate, but don't want to choose one side over the other. After World War II, the U.S. created a hegemonic order in East Asia. The U.S. provided security while promoting trade and democracy. With China rising, balance of power logic returns to East Asia. In some sense, there are two hierarchies, a security hierarchy led by the U.S. and an economic hierarchy led by China. In this dynamic, the U.S. can't push its allies too hard because they don't want to full-on balance against China. They want to continue doing business. China also must not be too aggressive, or countries may see it as a threatening great power and balance against it. Non-allied countries see the U.S. as a balancing partner against China. Even though they are mostly on friendly terms with China, they still value the U.S. as a military balancer. Asian states don't stand with the US, though. The Philippines and Thailand are both treaty allies with the US. The US has security partnerships with Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam. But few, if any, countries seem to really support the US. US allies and partners have deep economic links to China. They'd be reluctant to join the US in a conflict when their economic interests are at stake. 0 countries in the region have officially committed to supporting the US in a war over Taiwan. These countries don't want China to gain the power from controlling Taiwan, but are not willing to fight for it. Japan and Australia chose to go against the US and oppose a UN Commission on Human Rights resolution that condemned China for how it treated political dissidents. When the US sent a fleet during the 1996 Taiwan Strait crisis, US allies failed to endorse the move primarily out of concern for Chinese economic retaliation. Almost all of the East Asian countries distanced themselves from the US fleet movements. To quote one article, South Korea and the Philippines both stressed that their mutual defense treaties with the United States did not cover contingencies in the strait. Such countries as Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and Australia contented themselves with the banal response of urging restraint on all sides, conspicuously declining to endorse Washington's moves. Indeed, they echoed Beijing's position that Taiwan is merely a renegade province. Even Japan, the principal U.S. ally in the region, merely expressed understanding of the naval deployment. End quote. Countries in the region have indicated that they support the status quo on Taiwan. There's no indication that many, if any, countries would get involved if there was a war. Maybe Japan, and maybe Australia, under heavy U.S. pressure. The Philippines elected Duterte, who wanted to get closer to China. Next, Marcos was elected, who took a less hardline stance toward China than his opponents. He said arbitration over territory was not effective and that they had to seek a bilateral agreement with China. Asked in 2022 if he would ask the U.S. for help in the dispute with China, Marcos said, "What kind of help would the U.S. bring? Will they bring aircraft carriers and aim at warships? If war breaks out, who loses? Philippines. So let's not allow the problem to escalate to a shooting, to a war." China was able to convince several ASEAN countries to not support the Filipino UNCLOS decision. At times, China seemed to have bought off Malaysia and Filipino South China Sea claims with trade, investment, and assistance. The South Korean president chose not to meet Nancy Pelosi in 2022 during her East Asia tour that included Taiwan. China and Vietnam have set up a hotline between their Navy chiefs and have conducted many joint Navy patrols off the Gulf of Tonkin. Vietnam is not purchasing arms or receiving military aid from the U.S. Vietnam has 3 no's: no military alliances, no aligning with one country against another, and no foreign military bases on Vietnamese territory. Vietnam is at least as worried about U.S.-led regime change as they are about China. Anti-U.S. editorials are regularly published, and Vietnam supports Russia and Ukraine. Vietnam's anti-Americanism has not disappeared. It's not clear how much the Quad matters. The Quad is not a military alliance. Unlike Australia and Japan, who can be seen as U.S. allies, India desires to be independent from both China and the West. Singapore relies on the U.S. to sell them weapons and do general balancing in the region, but is not a U.S. ally. Generally, there is no great contained China coalition. Countries continue to deepen their economic and diplomatic ties with China. On the other hand, there are some modest diplomatic efforts. In 2024, leaders from South Korea, Japan, and New Zealand attended the NATO summit for the 3rd year in a row. Australia sent a deputy prime minister. South Korea and Japan are sending military supplies and aid to Ukraine, although North Korea is supporting Russia with ammunition. China sends Russia machine tools, microelectronics, and other technology that helps Russia build weapons. These modest diplomatic efforts don't seem to indicate that the countries of the region are ready to start balancing China if the U.S. backs off. Most Asian countries don't consider China a threat to their survival. They are more concerned with economic or domestic issues than with China being too powerful or taking land. The territorial disputes don't threaten countries' survival and are not worth a war over, at least in the eyes of most Southeast Asian countries. If the countries of the region won't stand with the U.S., I'm skeptical that they'll stand without her. Asian states aren't militarily balancing. Across East Asia, the percentage of the economy spent on defense is half of what it was in 1990. From 1990 to 2021, average defense spending for the 9 key East Asian countries went down from 2.88% of GDP to 1.6% of GDP. From 2012 to 2021, Japan's military budget increased almost 18%. Over that same period, China's increased 72%. In May 2022, the Japanese Prime Minister said he'd increase defense spending to 2% of Japan's GDP. While Japan is increasing their spending, it's not clear that they will spend enough to massively increase the power of their military. Countries are not heavily building asymmetric capabilities that would actually scare China, and they're reluctant to allow U.S. missiles that China finds threatening on their territory. Developing and implementing such capabilities would take time. Only Vietnam has developed the A2AD capabilities to challenge Chinese control of the South China Sea. Anti-ship cruise missiles, surface-to-air missiles, and modern submarines would help a lot. Even Taiwan is focused on expensive equipment like F-16s and main battle tanks over items more effective in a conflict with China. In 2000, Taiwan spent 2.6% of its GDP on defense and had 290,000 military personnel in uniform. By 2021, those fell to 1.74% and 169,000. This is despite that the U.S. has not committed to defending Taiwan. As of 2020, Taiwan's trade with China was 36% of Taiwan's GDP. Southeast and East Asian states are acting as if there is no Chinese threat and like they have no intention of preparing militarily to balance China. China's neighbors want to save money, focus on other interests, and not antagonize China. China has effectively bullied its neighbors into not balancing militarily against it to the point that if China did want to conquer, it would be relatively easy unless the U.S. intervenes. The fact that China's neighbors are not increasing spending, while China is massively building up their military, shows China's intentions. Because there is no regional threat, China's military buildup is not about defense, but about being able to take out the U.S. military in East Asia. Additionally, that China has been having a massive military buildup while its neighbors' military spending is flat or down as a percentage of GDP, indicates that these countries have no intention of militarily balancing China. Japan's 2022 NSS showed Japan's plan to spend 2% of GDP on defense by 2027. That's a big change compared to 1%, but still not a ton. It still leaves Japan woefully weak compared to China. In East Asia, there is a one-country arms race. China is greatly increasing its military, while the other countries do relatively little. East Asian military spending as a percentage of GDP is at the same low level as Latin America's. Latin America has no growing and aggressive China greatly building its military. East Asia does. Yet, East Asia can't be bothered to spend more on their military any more than the Latin Americans. Maybe this spending would shoot up if the U.S. left. Maybe they are just free riding on the U.S. But it seems that many countries just don't see the China threat and won't if the U.S. leaves. It seems like they will be content to live in a region dominated by China and will make no attempt to balance China militarily. Asian states heavily trading with China. China is the largest foreign investor in Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. The U.S. is the largest foreign investor in China, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and Singapore. China has 9 bilateral or multilateral free trade agreements, while the U.S. has 3. China is providing much more development assistance than the U.S. By 2019, trade with China was 27% of all regional trade, while the U.S. portion fell to less than 20%. If we include Hong Kong and Macau in Chinese trade, their portion is 35% of all East Asian trade. In 2020, China and 14 other countries joined the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, including Japan, Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and South Korea. The U.S. did not join. Its goal is lower tariffs, more investment, and the freer movement of goods. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, would have been a large trade agreement, but the U.S. pulled out. The other countries went forward with it as the Modified Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. The U.S. claims that the Chinese company Huawei is involved in espionage and should be banned. The U.S. banned its 5G from the U.S. Countries like Australia, Japan, Vietnam, and India have restricted Huawei. New Zealand lifted a ban on Huawei in 2020. South Korea's stance on Huawei is not clear, but Huawei buys a lot of Korean products. Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia are open to Huawei. The top trading partner for most countries in Southeast Asia is China. These countries also gain from a lot of Chinese investment, tourism, and other economic opportunities. The U.S. is ASEAN's second largest trading partner and the largest investor. Considering these countries have such deep economic ties with China, and that they are showing no sign of military balancing, it doesn't seem like they would balance China if the U.S. backed out. Surveys show a split region. Most countries in the region want good relations with the U.S. and China. In a 2022 State of Southeast Asia survey of elites in ASEAN countries, a question asked which country they would choose if forced to align with the U.S. or China. 43% said China, 57% said the U.S. A 2021 poll resulted in people saying the top 3 challenges in Southeast Asia were health and pandemics, unemployment and the economy, and widening socioeconomic gaps and rising income disparity. Notice that China's aggressiveness was not a top 3 concern. A 2024 poll found that 50.5% of respondents from the 10 ASEAN countries would choose China over the United States if forced to choose a strategic partner. A year before, 61.1% chose the United States. The change is mostly due to respondents from Laos, Indonesia, and Malaysia. Respondents from Cambodia, Thailand, and Myanmar also more modestly increased their favor toward China. If the U.S. has such split support now, how much will we lose if we move to offshore balancing? Such a move could destroy U.S. credibility. Asians don't want to be dominated. The regional powers had the incentive to not let China dominate the region. Russia cherishes its influence in Central Asia. India wants to prevent Chinese from expanding in the Himalayas, South Asia, and the Indian Ocean. Japan doesn't want to live in a region dominated by China, even if China is the strongest state. Many Asian countries have developed their identity around not being China, like Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. They don't want to be dominated by China. Central Asian nations are good at playing Russia and China off one another. They won't submit one way or the other and will not abandon Russia. North Korean officials have said they distrust China more than the Americans because the U.S. is far away and China is close. India is a big, ancient country that will never submit to China. Indonesia is a large country who wants to make money from anyone and not be told what to do. One reason other countries may reject China's hegemony is because it lacks moral authority for its influence. Historically, the Chinese Empire had a level of moral authority. But the modern Communist Party-led Chinese Empire has not developed the same level of moral authority with its neighbors, nor within its own borders, where it relies more on economic success than believed ideology. We haven't seen heavy balancing behavior yet, but it's possible that if China aggresses too much, countries of the region would quickly balance internally and externally. Of course, by the time they band together, it's possible that it will be too late. Regional countries are concerned that the U.S. leaving could be destabilizing and start a series of self-help. Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Thailand are willing to allow China to have the South China Sea. Brunei, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Singapore don't much care about the mainland's water security. Mainland countries don't want to be dominated, so try to build relationships with other major powers. Thailand is a U.S. treaty ally, but keeps getting closer to China. Indonesia, Myanmar, and the Philippines are democracies and therefore are more sympathetic to the U.S. Laos, Thailand, and Cambodia are authoritarians and favor China. Vietnam moved closer to the U.S. by joining the TPP, receiving Obama in May 2016, and achieving an end to the U.S. arms embargo and normalized relations. Most countries believe that the U.S. has been helpful in promoting free trade, at least before the Trump era, and want the U.S. to balance China and provide deterrence. Asian states appreciate U.S. assistance in building better governmental institutions and civil society and offering educational opportunities. Asian states want a steady and reliable American presence at important summits. They also appreciate the U.S. role in creating international norms, rules, and institutions. But appreciation doesn't say much about what these countries will do if the U.S. leaves. They seem to like having the U.S. to balance China and promote free trade, but that doesn't mean they'd step up if the U.S. left. Asians may not want to be dominated by China, but they show little sign of backing up that desire with serious balancing. Should the U.S. offshore balance? There are at least 4 reasons why the U.S. should end its policy of forward deployment in East Asia. 1. The U.S. wants to avoid being dragged into war at a time an opponent chooses. With many forces in the region, a country could choose to preemptively strike them, instantly bringing war upon the U.S., rather than the U.S. getting to take its time to react and intervene. Second, regional powers are in a better place to deter China than the U.S. Local countries can more credibly commit to defend their key national interests. Third, retrenchment would signal to the region that the U.S. is not interested in dominance and lower tensions while improving relations. This would lower Chinese fears of a U.S. committed to dominance and others' fears of an all-out superpower rivalry. Local powers can build up their militaries without striking the same fears into China because they are so much weaker than the U.S. and China. China perceives an increase in U.S. military in the region as hostile, while not necessarily so for local powers who want to defend their homelands. Fourth, pulling out of the Indo-Pacific could save trillions of dollars over the decades. All 4 of these reasons are flawed. Time of our choosing. While the U.S. being forced into a war at the time of an opponent's choosing is a major downside, this isn't so different in offshore balancing. In such a strategy, the U.S. is still committed to join a war for the sake of balancing, so still would have war upon it at a time of an opponent's choosing. The U.S. would just have a little more time to get ready, while the ally took the brunt of the fighting. Rather than using forward deployed positions, the U.S. would have to transport all their troops and equipment to freshly made bases, possibly under combat. This is a more difficult undertaking than reinforcing forward deployments. The U.S. would have to bring together coalitions, access, and basing agreements in the middle of a war. It would be difficult to work with governments and militaries that the U.S. isn't as used to working with. The U.S. would deal with greater logistical problems as everything has to be moved fresh to the region. Establishing a new presence is harder than reinforcing an existing one. The U.S. would no longer have basing, port, and airfield infrastructure. Ships need to refuel and planes need to land. It's difficult to offshore operate with just supply ships rather than land bases. Such ships quickly become targets in a conflict. Staying in East Asia helps maintain strong institutionalized alliances, established basing patterns, logistics, access, and high levels of interoperability. These would be weakened under offshore balancing and make it much harder to fight back into the region to balance an aggressive China. Credible deterrence. While it's true that regional powers have the most incentive to deter China because it's their own neighborhood, territory, and homeland economies, they may not have the power to do so successfully, and many of the countries don't seem to have the will or proper fear to do so. What's a better deterrence, Japan and smaller allies, or the United States, Japan, and smaller allies? If France and the UK would have agreed to an alliance sought by the Soviet Union, World War II would likely not have happened, as Germany would have to fight a two-front war and could not get away with taking land in Central Europe. It appears that NATO successfully deterred the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The U.S. in the region as an ally is better deterrence than just regional countries. The U.S. would lose the advantage of U.S. troops acting as tripwires that automatically bring the U.S. into wars. These are helpful to convince countries that the U.S. is credible when it says it will help in the case of invasion. Without the tripwire, aggressive countries can always think, maybe the U.S. won't really mount a massive war across the Pacific for some Asian ally. This makes war more likely. Under offshore balancing, China could do death by 1,000 cuts in gray zone attacks. They could keep doing this, and the U.S. wouldn't intervene because to do so would be a massive operation due to the U.S. having no capabilities in the region. Without U.S. coordination, China may be able to pick off Asian countries one by one, either economically or politically. U.S. threatening? ? It's conceivable that if the U.S. pulls back to an offshore balancing role, this will make China feel less threatened and therefore act less aggressively. It's more likely that this will make local countries greatly ramp up their militaries, making China feel more threatened. If countries like Japan feel like they don't have the U.S. to back them up, they may intensively build up their military and act aggressively to show their ability and willingness to defend their interests, causing China to fear them. This could spiral to war. While it's true that China sees a U.S. military presence as threatening and even a continuation of humiliations, the Chinese Communist Party rules the continuation of the Chinese Empire. And in both cases, we are talking about aggressive, expansionist ideologies that never stop expanding until they are forced to. Chinese empires and the Chinese Communist Party don't need a U.S. presence to act aggressively and to want to domineer over Asia. Chinese aggression will be worse without a counterpower, not better. While China claims they only act aggressively in the case of their core interests, they can declare anything their core interests. China declares the country they suppress and colonize, Tibet, and lands they wish to do this to, Taiwan and the South China Sea, their core interests. It's possible that war is more likely when the U.S. aids multiple countries near China while not maintaining top-down influence. Many of the countries around China hold disputes with China, and if they are given stronger capabilities to act independently without U.S. top-down influence, they may make decisions that lead to war. If multiple countries start acting independently and aggressively in the eyes of China, this could make China act more aggressively and result in conflict. So, tensions won't cool if the U.S. leaves, for two reasons. One, China will act more aggressive without a counterpower to stop them. Two, those countries who want to show China that they will fight hard to defend their interests will act more aggressively, potentially sparking a conflict. Save money? Bringing the troops home in an offshore balancing strategy won't save so much money, if any. An offshore balancing strategy would still need the ability to produce dominance on the seas and in the air in order to battle through the theater in need of balancing. So, huge investment and production costs would not be avoided because high-tech weaponry and well-trained forces would be needed to do this. This would also require a large military that can be rapidly mobilized. The savings from closing foreign bases alone are relatively small. The costs of such bases are partially offset by foreign countries. The CBO estimated that bringing almost all Army forces from around the world back home would save less than $1.5 billion a year. If anything, with the U.S. having higher escalation costs and with weaker ability to intervene in disputes, an offshore balancing strategy leaves the U.S. more relying on nuclear weapons, which could mean a higher expense to have a better nuclear force. A scholar has estimated that the U.S. could maintain a military capable of offshore balancing at 2.5% of GDP. A. This number is doubtful. B. This is only 0.5 percentage points less than the U.S. spending at the end of the 1990s and 1 point lower than near-term projections. These would be savings of 16 to 29% compared to post-Cold War spending. Even given this 2.5% number, the resulting defense cuts would only have a marginal impact on the economy and deficit. Offshore balancing has a decent chance of being more expensive when, without U.S. forces ensuring allies and deterring potential aggressors, war breaks out and the U.S. has to enter a major war to restore the balance of power. This is what happened in the World Wars and the Persian Gulf in 1990. Having to fight major wars to beat back a rising regional hegemon is very, very expensive. A forward deployment helps keep the peace. That saves money in the long run. Furthermore, just because the U.S. is forward deployed doesn't mean it will commit costly invasions like it did in Afghanistan and Iraq. And just because it isn't forward deployed doesn't mean it won't. Syria is planning on fighting a major war from the homeland if an ally is attacked may need more expensive preparation than keeping forces abroad because such a war will be more difficult. Aircraft carriers are the most important offshore tool, and they are more expensive than land-based forces. If everything is sea-based, then we lose subsidies from countries helping support our land bases in their territories. If conflict increases as a result of U.S. leaving the region, U.S. economic interests in the region will be damaged. If China can destroy norms like the law of the sea in the South China Sea, then it is more likely to be repeated elsewhere, resulting in more global instability. U.S. credibility would be greatly damaged if the U.S. abandoned its allies, or was even perceived as abandoning its allies. Both of these would have negative economic ramifications. U.S. allies and partners in one region judge U.S. commitment to themselves based on how committed the U.S. is to the defense of other regions. Middle East and Asian allies saw the cancellation of Third Sight missile defense in 2009 as possibly portending U.S. lack of commitment to themselves. Japan was also worried about the 2009 cancellation, thinking China may have seen that and act more aggressively, thinking the U.S. may back down in East Asia like it did in Europe. Gulf states and Taiwan have told European diplomats of their concern when the U.S. changes policy in Central Europe. Israelis see parallels between themselves and Taiwan. In Central Europe, officials were concerned with how the U.S. responded to the 2010 Xianan incident in the Yellow Sea. Eastern Europe pays attention to U.S. cooperating with its East Asian allies. The point here is, if the U.S. leaves East Asia, this may embolden opponents and weaken the trust of partners around the world. This lack of worldwide credibility would make it more difficult and more costly for the U.S. to protect its interests around the world. Alliances give the U.S. leverage in economic negotiations with allies. The U.S. willingness to defend its allies makes the allies more willing to accept a global order and specific deals that economically benefit the U.S. So, what would happen if the U.S. left? If the U.S. moved to an offshore balancing strategy by pulling its troop out of the region while maintaining military aid and alliances, there's a decent chance that countries would not trust that the U.S. would fight across the Pacific to defend Asian countries. To ensure their independence, countries who felt threatened, like South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, would develop nuclear weapons. These countries may also form a military balancing coalition, possibly with help from India and Australia, and truly stand ready to counter China. However, most other countries will likely continue to try balancing diplomatically, but not with actual military forces. China would over time gain more and more power and influence until it's the hegemon of Southeast Asia, controls all disputed territory, and sets the rules of Southeast Asia. Other than nukes, it seems unlikely that Japan, South Korea, or Taiwan would massively increase their military spending to a point that their militaries could put up a real conventional defense against a determined China. They have shown no such willingness so far, and any military increases are actually quite small. With a Chinese conventional advantage, China will test these countries' willingness to respond and slowly gain ground using its superiority in conventional forces, gray zone forces, and economics. Eventually, the nuclear line will be drawn, but it will be drawn at a point where China is the region's dominant power, setting the rules of the region, with the power to limit or allow economic activity in different countries and through different routes. With heavy influence in most countries' political systems, the ability to limit U.S. political influence in regional countries, and possibly in control of Taiwan by means of military invasion or economic coercion. In the case of China pushing other countries around, the U.S. nor any of her allies will intervene when U.S. power is on the other side of the Pacific. Maybe the U.S. would intervene if South Korea or Japan were invaded, but outside of anything so extreme, China will be in control and it won't make sense to perform a massive cross-Pacific intervention or use nuclear weapons. Without the U.S. in the region, China will be in the driver's seat because the cost of escalation for them is relatively small. They can use their proximity and economic influence to coerce with economics, gray zone, or conventional military operations. The U.S. would have to launch a massive long-range operation from the mainland, and regional powers would be too weak to match China toe-to-toe. If the U.S. completely abandons the region, I would expect similar results. I don't see a Chinese empire where China actually invades the entirety of countries other than Taiwan, but I do see a soft Chinese empire where China is the hegemon that gets its way in the region. Another possibility is that Japan rallies a few countries to significantly strengthen their militaries and join some sort of alliance. The critical testing point of this alliance would be Taiwan, and there's a good chance that a regional war would be sparked over Taiwan that would see Japan and China as the main participants. Why should we care? How would a China-dominated Asia affect the United States? The Indo-Pacific, and specifically East and Southeast Asia, may be the most important economic region in the world. The Indo-Pacific is the world's center of gravity. The region supports more than 3 million American jobs and brings in almost $900 billion in foreign direct investment to the U.S. the region may move 2/3 of future global economic growth. About a third of global shipping traverses the South China Sea. Japan and Korea use it for energy and raw material imports, as well as exports. 60% of Australia's trade passes through it. There may be a lot of oil and gas under the South China Sea. Over half of global fishing vessels are there, and millions use the sea for food and work, although it's being significantly overfished. As of 2015, about 12% of the global fish catch came from the South China Sea. If China could control the South China Sea, it could shut down global trade between, to, and from regional countries. It would also be able to use the islands to project power with missiles and planes. If China controlled East and Southeast Asia, it could limit U.S. economic access to the region. They could end free and open access to the oceans and keep shipping routes. China could block access to the region's huge markets. China could limit U.S. political access to promote democracy and human rights. Without the U.S., China would have more influence and power to support and expand authoritarianism. This power may be more concentrated in East Asia, but would expand throughout the world, making more and more of the world ruled by tyranny and countries who are wary of democratic countries like the U.S. If the U.S. pulled out, it would lose its defensive First Island Chain barrier. The First Island Chain goes from Japan to Taiwan to the Philippines and into the South China Sea. With the First Island Chain intact, China has difficulty extending power far past their shores. Any military operation would be vulnerable to forces on these islands, and supporting logistics would have to run a gauntlet of weapons and navies based on these islands. Also, the islands could house forces that could harass or blockade Chinese trade with mines, submarines, and small missile boats, making China vulnerable in the event of a conflict. Not only does holding the First Island Chain help hem in China, but if China controlled it, they could use it to disrupt U.S. aid to allies by utilizing naval bases, anti-air missiles, and anti-naval missiles placed on the islands. When China does not control the First Island Chain, China will always have to focus a fair amount of military assets on defending itself from this maritime periphery, and therefore will have trouble expanding its power out into the rest of the world. How far China will expand its dominance and threats are hard to predict. It's a country with a history of imperial expansion, led by a communist party. Currently, they use gray zone tactics to bully in the South China Sea. Later, it may be Hawaii or the Caribbean. The U.S. could be put in a situation where it has to decide between an all-out war with a nuclear power to defend Hawaii or backing down. Such a predicament becomes more likely if the U.S. lets China have the First Island Chain. Taiwan's peace and independence matters to the United States and the world for multiple reasons. Taiwan is a critical node in the First Island Chain. If China controlled Taiwan, it could base underwater surveillance, submarines, and air defenses on Taiwan, limiting the ability for the U.S. to operate, and weakening its ability to defend its allies. This would make it more difficult for the U.S. to maintain the balance of power in the region. Taiwan is 70 miles from Japanese territory and 120 miles from the Philippines. From Taiwan, a military could bomb, shell, or hit with missiles most of China's major population areas. Taiwan's mountains are great locations for radars. Japan launched its invasion of Shanghai from Taiwan. China is a net food and energy importer, and from Taiwan, anti-ship missiles could aid in a blockade. That said, because Taiwan is in reach of China's modern weapons, this reduces its military value somewhat. Japan and South Korea rely on the same strait as China for energy and food imports. Being between China's coast, Japan, and Southeast Asia makes Taiwan in a key strategic location. Asian allies may doubt that the U.S. really would intervene to protect them if the U.S. didn't defend Taiwan. This alone could lead to such allies bandwagoning with China or ramping up their own militaries, including developing nuclear weapons. The U.S. not defending Taiwan would not only weaken U.S. credibility in the eyes of allies, but in the eyes of China. Taiwan's great strategic position, combined with the flush of success, could embolden China to act more aggressively, and this could spark more major wars. Once Taiwan is taken, China would truly be dominant in East Asia and could then more easily look out onto the world and act aggressively in distant waters and on distant shores. U.S. Pacific territories like Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, and Hawaii would be most vulnerable. Ultimately, even America's west coast would be under threat. Because Taiwan is so key to the semiconductor industry, and because semiconductors are in so many products, an attack or blockade on Taiwan would severely damage the world economy. Taiwan is more than just a factory. Taiwan's semiconductor industry consists of several nodes in the supply chain that require specific chemicals and materials. Taiwan is the United States' 8th largest trade partner and is a major investor in the U.S. If China was able to conquer Taiwan by force, that would further break the norm that taking land by force is wrong and unacceptable in the international community. China taking Taiwan would also be the death of a successful and flourishing democracy. This wouldn't only be a travesty in itself, but Taiwan shows Asians and China that a culturally Chinese people can thrive in a democracy. Losing Taiwan would lose this beacon. On proliferation, being active in a region allows the U.S. to take part in operations and cooperation to restrict the components needed for nuclear weapons. 3 problems with Japan going nuclear are damage to the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, a weakening of the U.S. nuclear shield and the U.S.-Japan alliance, and could signal to others that Japan is starting a path of security independence from the U.S. In summary, China dominating East and Southeast Asia would make China a greater military threat around the world, allow China to weaken or destroy U.S. economic connections with Asian countries, weaken U.S. credibility in such a way that makes countries around the globe less likely to believe U.S. commitments, strengthen the hand of autocracy, making diplomacy and actions more difficult as more countries see the U.S. as an outsider democracy, and allow China to focus on influencing the rest of the world because its home region is secure. Mitigations. There are a handful of mitigations that may soften our concerns about China controlling the region. China's population may peak in 2029 at 1.4 billion, falling to 1.36 billion in 2050 and 1.17 billion by 2065. Simultaneously, the population is on balance older, which means more people will be frail and retired. China's fast economic growth has slowed. China may have fallen into the middle income trap. On avoiding a direct attack on the U.S., one just needs enough deterrence. Weapons of mass destruction, modern conventional technology, and 2 oceans make the U.S. hard to attack directly. On exploiting conquered or dominated lands, this is hard to do from knowledge, intellectual property, and factories where you need the people to cooperate to get the full gains from them. On limiting economic cooperation with the U.S., it's hard to say which territories and trade routes are key. There are usually other routes and other places to trade and gain certain resources. The U.S. can diversify export markets and minimize reliance on imported raw materials by stockpiling, diversification, and substitution. And imports and exports are a relatively small piece of U.S. GDP. China would need to have dominance over far more than just East Asia to have the power to dominate the U.S. Despite these mitigations, the risks are real and likely. Countries like the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, Imperial Germany, and Saddam Hussein's Iraq don't stop spreading their power and dominance because they are satiated. They are never satiated. There is always some grievance, some bullshit justification for grabbing more power. If the Chinese Communist Party was a benevolent force that just wanted power so it could support free trade and the sovereignty of peoples, then maybe we wouldn't have much to worry about. But that party still officially believes in communism, revolution, authoritarianism, and control. China has given clear indications that it wants to dominate East and Southeast Asia, and it wants more influence globally. If the Chinese Communist Party succeeded in its goals of Indo-Pacific dominance, it would consolidate its power and then use it to weaken the economies and influence of other countries it sees as threats. The Chinese Communist Party will always see the U.S. as a threat, no matter what the U.S. does, because the U.S. is a great power and shows that freedom is a viable option. The CCP will use its dominance to weaken the U.S. economically and eventually put pressure on the U.S. in its home regions and homeland. Living under such a situation would see the economic prospects of average Americans greatly reduced. It would also insult the dignity of a free people. Such a situation could easily spark a war between nuclear powers. If there's going to be a war, It'd be much better for the US to start out with friends, allies, troops, and equipment arrayed off China's coast. And if there isn't going to be a war, it'd be better to have the status quo be China living begrudgingly in a region with other free countries that can deter it because of their own forces and because of their ally, which is already forward deployed in the region, rather than a peaceful status quo where China more damages the freedom and checkbook of Americans. Furthermore, a large war is less likely when the US shows a strong front with its allies in Asia, rather than looking weak by either retreating while promising to launch a massive operation fully from the homeland, or by completely abandoning the region. Wait, is it the US that is power-hungry and must be stopped? I know many will see some of my descriptions of China as an aggressive country and think, that's a description of the United States. It is the US that is ever expansionist and aggressive. There's no doubt that Manifest Destiny was about essentially conquering the mainland United States from sea to sea, and white settlers essentially stole Hawaii from its native inhabitants. So, like China, the US is a large country created by conquest. The US intervenes covertly, politically, economically, and militarily all over the world. Aren't they the true aggressors by having military forces off China's coast? A. Much of the intervening was done in the name of the Cold War, where the US faced off against the tyrannic Soviet Union, whose goal was worldwide communist revolution. If that had succeeded, the world would be far less free and far more poor because communism results in tyranny and poverty. No doubt, mistakes were made in the Cold War fight, but let's not pretend US actions were about greed or wars of conquest. Similarly, post-Cold War interventions were honestly done for humanitarian reasons or to fight terrorism. B. The US doesn't remain in East Asia by force or coercion. Countries want the US there. The US presence helps countries not be dominated by their authoritarian neighbor. While it's true that the US presence there was the result of wars, specifically World War II and the Korean War, it remains there to help defend allies and global trade. So, while US aggression in the last 100 years has been for noble causes that generally benefit the world, China is stealing territory for its own sake. It is doing so by force, despite international law supporting the countries they stole that land from. While the US in East Asia defends allies and promotes free trade and freedom, China promotes submission, obedience, and giving it any territory it says is theirs. These two countries are not the same. Conclusion. The Indo-Pacific is important to the US for economic, security, and credibility reasons. If China dominates East and Southeast Asia, it could cut off trade and investment to, from, and through the region. This could greatly weaken the United States and make Americans poorer. With China's home base secure, it can focus on extending its power outward to Africa, the Middle East, Hawaii, the American Pacific coast, the Caribbean, etc. The U.S. would be seen as abandoning partners and allies in the region, and the U.S. would not be trusted around the world, which would weaken U.S. security and cost the country economically. But if the U.S. left the region, would China dominate? China is surrounded by strong countries that don't want to be dominated. Many Southeast and East Asian countries identify themselves partly by not being Chinese. Countries want to be independent and free from the domination of any power, especially one that has shown its willingness to throw its weight around for its unenlightened self-interest. Without the US, it's possible that Japan, the Philippines, Australia, South Korea, and India would band together, cooperate, and massively build up their militaries to serve as a successful deterrent to Chinese hegemony. The problem with that notion is the countries of the region show little sign of doing it. India mostly cares about India, not leading a balancing coalition in East and Southeast Asia. Many Southeast Asian countries already show signs that they'd submit and bandwagon rather than taking on the daunting task of balancing China. Despite some issues, they don't see China as a threat. South Korea has its hands full with North Korea and already handles China with soft gloves. Australia is fairly far away and much smaller than China. Japan has shown the best signs of leading a balancing coalition, but Japan is considerably smaller than China, and even its military buildup is actually quite small. While China is going on a massive military buildup, the countries of East and Southeast Asia are not growing their military spending as a percentage of GDP. If the US left the region, the most likely outcome would be a Southeast Asia gradually more and more controlled by China. Taiwan would either be subsumed by China or quickly develop a nuclear arsenal. South Korea would develop nuclear weapons as a deterrent to North Korea, just as much as to deter China. And Japan would also go nuclear to ensure itself against nuclear blackmail. China would be more free to punish any country around the globe economically, including the United States, and more free to extend its power out into the world. There's a possibility that Japan, India, and Australia would lead a counterbalancing coalition that many countries in the region would join. But China has so much leverage that this doesn't seem likely. Without the US, the chances of war increase. China will be emboldened to take military actions. It would increase its demands on Taiwan and likely invade if Taiwan remains defiant. China would want to conquer Taiwan before it developed nukes. Tensions between Japan and China would be very high, and Japan may retaliate aggressively against any slights to make sure China knows Japan will fight hard to defend its interests. This could spark an all-out war between Japan and China. Such a war would be devastating to the world economy and make most Americans poorer. Despite that China is not a communist system, it is still led by an ideological communist party. Communist parties believe in brutal authoritarianism for the sake of worldwide people's revolution. They don't care about international norms or the sovereign rights of foreign countries. China today is essentially the continuation of the series of Chinese empires that have been around since before Christ. Such empires see other countries as inferior. They expand and conquer unless stopped by internal or external force. They expect submission from their periphery. China's aggressive actions in international organizations in the South and East China Seas, in sanctioning countries for evil reasons, in forcing Americans to limit their free speech outside of China if they want to do business in China, and its determination to force the free and democratic people of Taiwan to submit to its authoritarian rule. In these actions, China has shown it is not truly a peaceful nation who just wants free trade and harmony. Harmony to a Chinese empire means obeying the Chinese emperor. The US is not safe from a country whose population is quadruple that of the United States, whose economy is by some measures larger than that of the US, who is modernizing and growing its military at a rapid pace, and who is massively creating advanced nuclear weapons. Would the United States rather try to convince countries to keep trading with it and convince China not to bully it, while China controls the most important economic region in the world by having Hawaii and the US mainland armed to the teeth and prepared for a war off its coasts? Or would it be better to support allies and partners with common interests by standing strong with them in Asia and maintaining a balance of power in Asia using US strength combined with countries who do not want their region to be dominated by China? The most likely outcome of the US leaving East Asia is China domination that will have negative ripple effects across the globe. The second most likely outcome is a huge war between China and Japan that will have negative ripple effects across the globe. The third most likely, but quite unlikely, is the countries of Southeast and East Asia massively ramping up their militaries and cooperation to successfully balance China without a major war. If the US wants to avoid Chinese domination or seeing a major war in the region, it needs to fully engage diplomatically, economically, and militarily to convince China that aggression is not the best action, and so we can continue to negotiate a world where China and the US live together, and with their neighbors, in peace and prosperity. Well, I am Lone Candle. Like me, comment me, love me, because I love you. Or, in other words, whiny. Well, whiny? Whiny, 我继续，谢谢，你好. But seriously, whiny. Well, agape, aini? I don't know how to say agape in Mandarin. I've never been good at foreign languages. I took a lot of Spanish classes, but still can't speak Spanish. Te amo. Gracias. Hola. Te amo. Whiny. Daisuki. J-tem. Mahal kita. Okay. That's enough. Have a good day.